My crutches don't represent what I've lost. They represent what I've gained, Frankie explains. I wouldn't be able to walk without them. They're my transportation. I guess that's true for my wheelchair, too. It gets me where I need to go. I just don't want to have to use it for the rest of my life. I want to get better, you know. Frankie's face gets tense. Some of us don't have a choice. Our disabilities are permanent. This is how we live. We're not gonna get better. You don't even want to try to get better? I ask. What if there's something out there? A treatment that can fix your disability, or at least improve how you feel? I'm not broken, Frankie says. My disability isn't something to fix or overcome. It's something to find the good in. I don't understand, I say. If you believe in using crutches to make your disability easier, why don't you believe in recovering? Because people with my illness don't recover. It's just the way it is. I've been disabled since I was little, and I'll always need crutches or a wheelchair. There's a difference between me and someone like you, who's only been disabled for what? A few months? A year, I say, frowning. So my disability doesn't count because I haven't been sick my entire life? No. Your disability counts. But for all I know, you could recover tomorrow and go back to your old life, not giving a damn about people with disabilities. And even if that doesn't happen, even if you end up like me, disabled for the rest of your life, there's a lot you haven't experienced yet. A lot of hate and ignorance from abled people. Welcome to the Book Fair, Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. I am your host, Anthony, and it has been quite a while. I've been enjoying the time off since the last episode of this podcast, but I really have missed talking about children's literature, and in the case of today's episode, young adult literature. The book I'd like to talk about today is Something's Wrong with Micah by Jamison Hill. Jamison Hill is a poet, and Something's Wrong with Micah is his debut novel. It is a young adult story about Micah, a boy who becomes physically disabled after contracting an illness shortly after the death of his father. In the afterword, Jamison Hill talks about how this book was never meant to be, and yet it persisted. There was a lot of pushback about writing a story about a perspective character with a physical disability that is something unrelatable to a majority of readers. However, Jamison persisted and continued trying to get the book published before deciding to publish it independently instead of going through a traditional publishing house. And I think that sticking to his morals to publish it independently and the way that he wanted to was for the best. It does bear mentioning that Jamison is able-bodied and is writing this story about people with disabilities, and on its surface it does give me a little bit of the ick. However, the author does do his due diligence to represent disabilities tactfully. I personally would have liked to see this book co-authored by somebody with disabilities to give a more authentic feel to it, or maybe at least to more directly credit the people that the author consulted, as opposed to just including an author's note saying that he did speak to people with disabilities and medical professionals when appropriate. Just saying it would have been nicer to see the representation more at the forefront instead of the author's name being the only credit to it. That being said, Something's Wrong with Micah is a very good book. And I don't mean to say that in a almost disappointed tone that something that was written by an able-bodied person was great. I'm just saying that this book is kind of heavy. It starts off with Micah a year into his physical disability and several years after the loss of his father. Micah was the star football player for his high school, La Jolla Prep, and probably the first thing I noticed in reading this book was that it's very regional. I wasn't put off by the representation of disabilities or a POV character with disabilities. My point of not being able to connect with the book was how much it relied on knowing about Southern California. There were neighborhoods, restaurants, the school, La Jolla Prep, which I had to look up how to pronounce because of the way it was spelled. I just wasn't familiar with it. And of course, the book is also about a former high school football player, something that I have absolutely no experience with. I don't even like football. I don't even like sports to begin with. So having a character that I couldn't sympathize with from the start did feel a little bit abrasive in reading this book. However, it does jump straight into showing Micah's challenges with just getting out of bed, going to class in a building that wasn't accessible. He has to take his electric wheelchair up a steep incline on a sidewalk to reach one of the buildings that he has class in because the elevator had been out of service for several months. And it is there that Micah, he is very stubborn and hard-headed. He doesn't want to accept the fact that he is disabled. He tries to push back against it and prove that he's able to do things, or at least he's hesitant to ask for help. That's when we meet some of his old football friends who egg him on and tease him, saying that everyone thinks he's faking his illness, and his ex-girlfriend, who is a recurring character throughout the story that we learn was almost taking advantage of Micah, putting him on her social media for sympathy from followers. And it's a little cynical, which is one of my least favorite things in any book. I don't like to have this sensation that people other than the main character are disingenuous or fake, phony people who hide their emotions. I like to believe that everybody in the world is honest to a degree. We mask for sure. We wear masks in daily interactions. However, in literature, there should be less of that and more presenting characters straightforward. Now, of course, we do get Micah's perspective of this, where he is second-guessing their sympathy, their pity, and is kind of mad at them for how they just ignore him ever since he's gone off the football team. He is seen as less valuable, not because that's what the other characters feel, that's just the way that Micah feels about himself. Micah is also seeing a doctor named Dr. Klein and a psychiatrist, Dr. Durant, who is a specialist in treating people with physical disabilities. Dr. Klein and Dr. Durant both believe that Micah's illness is caused by his own mental blocking of trauma. They tell him that he needs to just ignore the fact that he is in a wheelchair, not talk about it to people, and pretend it isn't happening in order for his symptoms to go away and his illness to get better. They're pushing pseudoscience, and it's medical malpractice at its worst, where the doctors are doing things that are physically making it harder for Micah to get better and refusing to actually treat him. It's very frustrating, and it shows how helpless Micah is and unfortunately, the fact that there are doctors who are pushing these less reputable treatments is the reality for some people. They see a doctor, or maybe they have a parent who doesn't wish to prescribe medication. They want something more natural, and they end up never getting any better. The book does a pretty good job of representing Micah's struggles and making the main character feel helpless, which is kind of the point, but feels a little like it's talking down to people with disabilities. However, it is at this point where Micah is at his lowest, where he's placed in a life skills class, that he meets Evie, a young girl in a wheelchair as well. She is an amputee missing part of her leg. And of course, the book mentions that there are nasty rumors from other students about why she lost that leg. There is Frankie, a boy with musculature disability. He uses crutches, and that's the excerpt that came from the beginning of the podcast. And it is here where Micah begins to stop feeling sorry for himself and begin to question why it is that his doctors don't seem at all concerned with helping him. Instead, just pushing this idea that he is not doing enough to better himself. And of course, one of the more important characters, other than Evie, of course, is Frankie's girlfriend, who has a similar illness to Micah. Her symptoms are described where she is unable to stand or walk without feeling nauseous, throwing up, or passing out. And Micah starts to think that maybe this is what he has, as opposed to the depression and anxiety that his current doctors have prescribed him with. This is when Micah is able to stand up against his doctors and reject their treatments and goes to see Dr. Barrera, who is a specialist, again, an hour away in a specific South California neighborhood in San Francisco, and it's just very regional. It's hard to get a sense of scale or where these people are in relation to each other without being there. In a major area like I live, an hour drive is not that far. And so it's reasonable to say that you'll drive an hour to go visit somebody or a doctor's appointment, whereas in some parts of the country, a 20-minute drive and you're in another city, and you don't want to have to commute to another city for an appointment. One of the best parts of Something's Wrong with Micah comes from his initial appointments with Dr. Barrera. She is very comforting for Micah. She is affirming his symptoms and accepting everything he is saying, believing him, and of course, not belittling or downplaying or suppressing any of his feelings. He is very hesitant to share a lot of information, but it's only because of his past bad experiences with doctors. And it's Dr. Barrera who believes his symptoms and believes him because they are his real life lived experiences. And of course, it is based off of a real disease. And so, when Dr. Barrera puts Micah through several rigorous screenings for scanning, blood work, CT scans, it's all very realistic in the way it's depicted. It is Micah's first-person perspective of being in a CAT scan, of having blood work done, and it feels almost as if this is in there not just to score points for realism, but for young readers who are going through a situation where they don't know what's wrong with them. They may have some sort of physical illness that they can't explain. Something's Wrong with Micah shows that the tests and the screening for these things are something that a lot of people go through, and they're nothing to be afraid of. And I really appreciate that. Micah goes through physical therapy as well, and it is during physical therapy treatments with his friend Evie that the one point, I take off. I give Something's Wrong with Micah 4 stars out of 5 on Amazon and Goodreads because the pacing is split right down the middle, where the first half of the book is Micah dealing with medical abuse from his doctors, his struggles with accessibility in school, and then suddenly he starts going to physical therapy and he's able to be a little bit more ambulatory, not using his wheelchair all the time. And the second half of the book is almost entirely the romance plot between Micah and Evie. I just feel like the pacing of the book could have been tied together a little bit better. There, of course, are scenes in the book of Micah and Evie interacting outside of class, talking, flirting, and it's there. They aren't completely separated. Their disabilities and their journeys through recovery and therapy, and by therapy I mean physical therapy, they are intertwined. And we see that the rates at which they get better, of course, because Evie isn't just an amputee, she is dealing with an infection in her leg. So she's struggling with pain. She has a fitting for a prosthetic leg, and the infection in her leg makes wearing it uncomfortable. And so she is dealing with the frustrations of not being able to be free of the wheelchair in the same way that Micah is in the second half of the book. So that is tied together a little bit, very loosely, but only in the way that we are suddenly seeing Evie struggle with her disability. And of course, it is worth mentioning that this entire time, Micah has a dead dad. He and his mother are still grieving the loss of him. And it's kind of just left in the background. Grief is something that is always there. It's underlined, and there are moments where, in unrelated scenes, Micah is reminded of his dad, and it weighs down on him. It bothers him, and it makes him feel like his own disability and being bound to a wheelchair is his own type of way of struggling or representing his grief. And also, in the first parts of the book, they talk about how it was a car accident after a football game where Micah was just dismissing his dad and trying to get over a headache. And his dad was asking him questions, making sure that he was okay, telling him it's okay if he didn't want to play the game the next day or whatever. I don't know how sports work. And that's when there's a car accident that takes Micah's dad's life. And so, despite being almost a year later, Micah developing this illness and being bound into a wheelchair and struggling with his disability, they are representing the loss that Micah feels he should have suffered. He feels like he should have died in that car crash, or maybe instead of a few days in a hospital recovering from some bruises, that Micah may have fractured his legs, spine, severed something, and would have been paralyzed. It feels like this is what he deserves for surviving while his dad didn't. And that level of grief is something that is prevalent throughout Something's Wrong with Micah. And that's what makes it so beautiful. There is this sensation that all this suffering, how his life has changed for the worse, nothing will ever be the same. It all stems from losing his dad, losing somebody he cared about, losing his coach. His dad was his coach. And of course, learning to take back his autonomy, take power of his situation, take charge, where Frankie is able to tell him, teach him, that just because you're disabled doesn't mean that you're not stuck, that you're not unable to do things. Accessibility is a struggle, but being able to find the good in life, even when you're in a wheelchair, is what living with a disability is like. You know, Frankie has hobbies. He does, it's the weirdest thing, LARPing he has hobbies outside of school, and he teaches Micah about that. They begin watching movies at Evie's house. They find that they're able to continue having a social life, continue having fun, while still being in a wheelchair. And Micah, the entire time, he is struggling with his life is getting better, his health is getting better, but he still wants to play football. And that internal struggle is something that ties in beautifully to the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil that. Something's Wrong with Micah is foremost a book about grief and loss, losing family members, losing the way our lives were. In the case of Micah, his life is no longer the same, not just because of losing his dad. His life is changed, and even when he begins to show improvement, there are still days where he can't get out of bed and relies on his wheelchair. And that's something that is never going to go away for some people. And that's what makes these kinds of stories important. It's a great book, and well worth a read for children about 17, 18. It's a good book. Anyway, thanks for listening to The Book Fair, children's literature for grown-ups. I'll talk at you next time.